Good morning and welcome. My name is Daryl Dexter. I am an honorary distinguished fellow at the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance at Dalhousie University and vice chair at Global Public Affairs. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are here today on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, where sharing takes place pursuant to the Peace and Friendship Treaties. We also recognize the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people who have been here for over 400 years. Thank you for joining us for today's panel, Smooth Sailing or Stormy Seas, Tourism Makes a Comeback. Tourism is one of the world's most important economic sectors. It employs 1 in every 10 people on Earth and provides livelihoods to hundreds of millions more. Today, we are launching a new report titled Riding the Waves, Scenario Planning for the Atlantic Canada Cruise Industry During the Pandemic. The work was supported by the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency and is available on the MacEachen Institute website. The report summarizes scenario planning work the Institute undertook with the Atlantic Cruise Association during the pandemic. We have 4 distinguished panelists today to talk about the tourism sector and how it is recovering from the devastating losses of 2020 and 2021. The panelists will provide insight into lessons the tourism sector took away from the pandemic, how to put the sector on a more sustainable footing, how the sector will overcome labor shortages, transportation and logistics challenges, and heightened concerns over health. Our first speaker, Professor Kevin Quigley, is the scholarly director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance at Dalhousie University. Professor Quigley is a public administration scholar who specializes in risk governance and critical infrastructure, focusing in particular on public sector responses to rare and high impact events such as pandemics, natural disasters, industrial failures, and cyber and terrorist attacks. Professor Quigley has published 2 highly acclaimed books on critical infrastructure, including the most recent, Too Critical to Fail, How Canada Manages Threats to Critical Infrastructure, co-authored with Bissett and Mills, which was shortlisted for the 2018 Donner Prize, awarded for the best public policy book by a Canadian. Professor Quigley is working on a new book about government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and will provide an overview of the new scenarios report the MacEachen Institute has launched today. So over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Daryl. Okay, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak about our scenarios report that we did with the ACCA. It's a pleasure to present the results, and as Daryl mentioned, the report's on our website at the MacEachen Institute. So I'm going to just give a very brief overview of some of the work because of sort of time constraints today. But there's a lot more information available in the report, and I encourage you to review it. And if your time is limited, there are executive summaries available, and there's also a briefing note that summarizes the key points of the report. So I invite you to look at those documents. But just as sort of brief overview of some of the observations we made and the exercises that we went through. That's the purpose of my presentation. So just in terms of context setting, in case people weren't aware, before COVID-19, the cruise industry was growing with passenger arrivals up 52% between 2016 and 2019 in Atlantic Canada. The cruise ship passengers bring about 350 million to the region annually and support about 2,000 jobs. The pandemic resulted in the suspension of 2 consecutive cruise seasons for the region. So the project was conducted in partnership with the Atlantic Canada Cruise Association and supported by the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, ACOA. The purpose was to bring together members of the cruise industry and key stakeholders to participate in 2 rounds of scenario planning exercises to help the region identify and manage risks and seize opportunities in the short and medium term. And I'll just note that as Daryl mentioned, I'm a risk scholar, not necessarily a tourism scholar, though I think I've learned a lot about tourism over the last couple of years. But really my role was to bring the scenario planning tool and help to structure and facilitate the discussions, which I think we did with some success. So what is scenario planning? A scenario is a description of a possible future. It's a hypothetical sequence of events that is helpful in investigating causes and necessary decision points. It's not a prediction of the future. Scenario planning goes beyond typical forecasting exercises and thinking of incremental changes. It describes quite different futures and invites us to think of how to respond to them. It's a helpful method to examine risk in highly uncertain times during which you or your organization have limited control. There are some control points that you have, but you have limited control. So high degree of uncertainty and limited control, scenario planning lends itself to that kind of exercise, that kind of context. There are many methods in scenario planning. We use the intuitive logics method and draw on the work of Van der Hagen and Van de Salt, which might be described as the Dutch school of scenario planning. There are many stages to scenario planning. I'm going to just focus on steps 4, 5, and 6 very quickly, just to sort of situate you in terms of some of the method that we use and sort of develop it a little bit further. So after you go through an exercise of articulating what your goal is and having some exploratory discussion about the risk and the uncertainty that you're facing, you get to this step 4, framing the scenarios. So in that case, when you're framing scenarios, what you're trying to do is identify 2 key forces that drive your organization and over which you have very limited control. So here in this graph, you've got driving force 1 and driving force 2 on the driving force 1 on the vertical axis, driving force 2 in the horizontal axis. And from that, you are able to articulate 4 scenarios. So just to kind of put some flesh in the bones here, for example, when we did our first scenario exercise with the cruise industry, we took customer demand as one driver and the readiness of the destination as the second driver. So in this case, the vertical axis shows that customer demand is high, which is to say customer demand has bounced back for cruises, or customer demand is low, it has dropped off and it stays low during the pandemic. In the vertical, so that's the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we are talking about the destination readiness. And so either our destination is ready to receive these customers, these clients, these tourists, these cruise ships, or the destination is not ready to receive them. And so when you put it together, you create 4 scenarios. Scenario 1, customer demand is high and the destination is ready. So this is a kind of highly ideal situation to be in. There's demand for what you're doing and you're ready to receive people. Scenario 2, there is no demand for what you're doing, but you're ready to receive people. Scenario 3, you're not ready to receive people and customer demand is low. And scenario 4, customer demand is high, but you're not ready to receive people. So those are the 4 scenarios that we worked through in the scenario planning exercise. And that's the framework we basically use for all of our scenario planning exercises. So the step 5 then is to really develop some very rich text that describes these scenarios. So there's a number of questions that we work through as a group for each of the 4 scenarios. What does the scenario look like? How did you get to the scenario? What are the underlying causes that led to this? What are the potential critical failures? What are the opportunities? And then finally, you name the scenario. The last step then, when this exercise is over, is to develop some policies and strategies to address all 4 of the scenarios. So not just one particular scenario, not just your preferred scenario, not just the worst case scenario, to actually say, look, all these 4 scenarios are possible. So how do we start to ready ourselves in anticipation that any one of them could come to pass? So your strategy really is about recognizing the possibility of all 4 scenarios and recognizing to a degree they're outside of your control, to a degree. So our scenario planning exercise, I'll state just briefly, the project consisted of 7 scenario planning sessions throughout 2021. First ones were in the spring, last ones were in the fall. Round 1 focused on the return to cruises, which we assumed would be 2022, though we weren't sure. We were planning for a 2022 return, which turned out to be true. Round 2 focused on 3 to 5 year outlooks and included 2 exercises: environmental sustainability and the labor market. We worked closely with the ACCA to identify a diverse list of participants. There were about 25 people in each session. We applied the Chatham House rule, which means that we collected and summarized participants' ideas, but did not attribute them. And once we described the scenarios, we described and evaluated different opportunities to pursue. So I'm going to make some general observations about each of the 3 scenario exercises. I'm not going to get too specific. There's more information in the report, but just some general observations about each of the 3 in terms of content, things that people said. So with the first scenario plan, when we're talking about the return to cruise in 2022, the concerns really were about the capacity to host visitors. Could they receive people again? Did they have access to labor? Would they have the labor they needed? They were concerned about health protocols and a lot of concern about the fragility of local tourism supply chains. Would the supply chains come back? So obviously, when the cruise docks, there's a whole host of activities that happen in the port and in the region that are crucial for the success of the cruise and for our local economy. Would those supply chains return? There was concern about just the overwhelming complexity of the situation. It was overwhelming. Aligning standards and delivering consistent visitor experiences requires significant coordination and access to financial and human resources, access to which differs from port to port. So there are big ports in Atlantic Canada, there are some small ones, and they don't all have the same resources. So their capacity to respond to the circumstances varied. The uncertainty and speed with which directives changed was also quite disconcerting for many of the participants. Some of the opportunities we talked about in this scenario were strengthening the coordination with local supply chains, other regional ports, and key government, national tourism, and public health stakeholders. In the green scenarios, the concerns here were largely about the uncertainty about customers' willingness to pay for green experiences. There was some mixed evidence about there was support for green initiatives among the customer base, but at the same time, to what extent were people willing to pay for it? That was a little less clear. So there's some concerns about that. There were concerns. It's a very international business, of course, cruise. So there's concern also about government regulations at home and the ones that are abroad that will affect what we have to do at home. And then, of course, the financial constraints for investing in green practices. There were other concerns, much like most of the tourism sector and a lot of other sectors. The industry struggles with medium-term initiatives for which the standards and incentives are not always super clear. The opportunities we talked about in the green scenarios were to build on the region's reputation as being safe and environmentally friendly and prepare proposals in partnership with other stakeholders for future funding opportunities with an eye to advancing this agenda. Seizing opportunities, senior level buy-in was crucial, and community engagement also very important in terms of moving this agenda forward. On the labor scenarios, concerns here were the aging workforce and impact on tourism labor and operations, staffing shortages and capacity issues, and the lack of financial and human resources and access to relevant and time-sensitive information. There were concerns about addressing future labor issues that will require the sector to reconcile its need to professionalize with its ongoing dependence on lower wage and seasonal labor. So the opportunities that we discussed here were recruiting workers from different labor pools, strengthening partnerships with, and by different labor pools, I mean different demographic groups, strengthening partnerships with post-secondary institutions and settlement agencies, developing cluster employment initiatives, and continuing to professionalize the sector. And when I say different labor pools, I'm referring to the fact that different, whether you're talking about young people or older people, or different educational background skill sets, they might have different needs and different incentives to get them back into the workforce. That had to be taken into account. So just some final thoughts on the report. I see there are three significant advantages for the sector at this point. The importance of tourism has never been clearer. I think we saw through, the thing about the pandemic was everybody was affected by the sort of lockdowns that occurred. And so I think unlike a lot of crises and disasters, sometimes a disaster and crises affects one particular area. And so people simply pivot and go somewhere else. But in this case, lots of people were affected by the absence of tourism. So I think it was prominent throughout the pandemic, even though it was devastated. So I think the importance of the sector and its relationship to mental health issues, et cetera, was clear. And so this is something to build on. Getting the credit the tourism sector requires, it doesn't always get. There's also a strong interest in the region for partnerships in cruise. There's a clear payoff for working together in this region. The region doesn't always work collaboratively. Sometimes the provinces compete against each other, but in cruise, there's a real incentive for everyone to work together. So that's something to build off of. The sector has strong partnerships and institutional arrangements in place that were arguably made stronger during the pandemic. There is an opportunity to continue to build these partnerships at the local, regional, national level to advance important agenda items. Strong coordination is very important. My time is up, but I'll just end by saying I want to thank the ACCA and ACOA, the many guest speakers we brought into the event, and all the participants for their committed engagement in the process. It was a lengthy process, and people really leaned in, and we appreciated it. We enjoyed the work, and we hope it has value for you. And on that, I will say thanks, and back to you, Daryl.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next speaker is Sarah Rumley. Sarah is the Executive Director of the Atlantic Canada Cruise Association, a partnership between ACOA, Parks Canada, and port, tourism, and cruise ship interests in each of the 4 Atlantic provinces. Sarah brings over 20 years of combined port, administrative, and cruise marketing experience to the Atlantic Canada Cruise Association. She is passionate about the cruise industry and driving economic development and growth within Atlantic Canada. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Daryl. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to reflect on our scenario planning experience with the MacEachen Institute. And again, thank you to the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, ACOA, for the opportunity to work with the MacEachen Institute on this initiative. So Daryl did a wonderful job introducing the Atlantic Canada Cruise Association, but our reason for being is quite simple. We're here to share our beautiful cruise destinations in the region with the rest of the world. Our mission is to promote the sustainable growth of Atlantic Canada as a cruise destination through strategic partnerships, collaboration, as well as innovative marketing. Our vision is to have Atlantic Canada as preferred cruise destination in North America. So to provide some context, I know that Kevin touched on some of this in his introduction, but essentially we wanted to provide a snapshot as to what cruise in Atlantic Canada looked like before the pandemic. So as you can see, we had almost 875,000 passengers visit here in 2019 aboard 150 cruise ships, generating about 157 million in direct spending. And again, creating over 2,000 jobs. This was a significant increase over the last time we did our economic research, which was in 2016. So you'll see that in many cases, we were at 50 or a bit above for seeing that growth over that 3-year period. And of course, this information can be found within the MacEachen Institute report, as well as a link to where you can read the full report for the economic contribution to the cruise industry in Canada. Looking at, again, pre-pandemic and where we're at now. So unlike certain segments of tourism, it was a full shutdown for 2 years in 2020 and 2021. So we've seen cancellations and essentially no revenue to our ports and our destinations via cruise during that time. We're still in the process right now of doing our summarizing to see what our regional outcome was for 2022 and looking ahead to 2023. But as of now, we are forecasting about 450 calls. So this would be about 100 less than what we've seen in 2019, but definitely a wonderful rebound to see. And same goes for passengers. We're hearing from our ports that the fill rate on the ships, although it was anticipated to be quite a bit less, especially earlier in the cruise season, certainly towards the end, our peak season in September and October, those fill rates were anywhere between 80 and 90% full of passengers when they were calling our ports here in Atlantic Canada. Again, to provide some context about the cruise industry, Cruise Lines International Association, CLIA, is one of the industry leaders when it comes to cruise. We are a member of that organization, and they do prepare an outlook every year. So getting into that, they had predicted that 2022 would be the rebound year for cruise. And then basically we would look at full resumption in 2023. But we did see through this that the responsible resumption of cruise was a model for other modes of tourism and transportation. So, with the science-backed protocols, they were really leading the way with resuming safely. And of course, what's interesting to note for cruise is, in the US, they're mandated by the CDC, which is Center for Disease Control. Here in Canada, it's really a collaborative effort amongst many federal departments, being Transport Canada, Public Health Agency of Canada, and then some others like Canadian Border Services. So a lot of entities have to come together to decide when it's safe to resume operations. And as I said, here we're going to see that, 2023 globally, cruise should come back to those pre-pandemic levels, and then we should see that steady growth going forward. Cruise is a very resilient industry. where they're able to pivot and move their assets as required to seek the highest yields. So again, it would seem that based on 2022, based on those preliminary results, that we are certainly on track to seeing that strong recovery. So when we looked at our scenario planning, and again, Kevin did include some of this in his presentation, but essentially that high demand for cruise and destination readiness, the first scenario that we looked at was missing the boat altogether, meaning that there was no demand for cruise and the destination was not ready. Or pardon me, there was a high demand for cruise and the destination was not ready. Back at sea, this was the very best case scenario. So essentially there's a high demand for cruise and the destination was ready. And then we look at some of the not so great outcomes, which would be the deserted island, meaning there was destination wasn't ready and cruise wasn't ready to come back either, and empty ports, meaning that the demand was low for cruise, but the destination was ready. So as we work through this, and again, as we're reflecting on this season to see exactly where we landed on this table, this matrix, it's safe to say that cruise did come back and our destination was ready, but not without its challenges. And next up, we did look at the environmental sustainability, and this is looking through a bit of a longer view of the return of cruise. Not easy being green, meaning that, much like Kevin had mentioned in his presentation, that, whether or not it's a demand on the cruise side or a demand on the destination side, this part can be challenging. But at the same time, the all aboard for green is, we have the financial means, the cruise lines have the financial means and are in a position to be in that scenario. And then we look at the green won't float and green unseen, again, looking at the more unfavorable scenarios related to that. And then, of course, labor. And this is something that I think we'll be having a more robust discussion around, as well as sustainability. But essentially here we're looking at, that demand for cruise is high, but labor is low. So, cruising for a bruising is, we had a high demand for cruises coming back. We may not have had the labor in place to fulfill on those experiences. Full steam ahead, both cruise and the destination were completely aligned and able to deliver on those experiences. Abandoned ship, I believe essentially that was, there was a low demand for cruise, but the destination was ready. And cruising alone would be the opposite of that, where you would have the destination ready, but essentially the cruise was not. And I know that we spoke a little bit about the intricacies of supply chains, and cruise has its very own. So we do have this visual to kind of articulate all of the different players in the cruise industry. Essentially, there's the cruise lines, then we have the shore excursion providers. So locally here, we call them tour operators that are fulfilling those experiences. We also have ports and port authorities, their operational teams, their cruise port infrastructure. Then on the marine side, we have the ship's agents, pilots and tugs, labor, service providers on that end of things. And then, as I said earlier on, we have that collaboration with our government partners. So that happens at a federal, provincial, and municipal level as well. So our key takeaways from scenario planning, and the things that the MacEachen Institute helped us to identify through this process, was, really for business and communities to respond to a rapidly evolving circumstances, and to ensure that we're not entirely dependent on any single stream of revenue. So many of our ports, for some in Atlantic Canada, they're very reliant on cruise business. So they did not fare as well during the pandemic compared to ports that were a bit more diversified and have, cargo operations or maybe real estate holdings that would help carry them through. The cruise industry itself is always changing, so it's important for stakeholders to, proactively manage risk and seize opportunities as they present themselves. Agility and flexibility is really everything at the end of the day. As a region, we continue to work together to ensure we maximize the benefits from the cruise ships visits to our communities. And I think that it's, important to note that through this process, we also identified opportunities for us to work more closely with our communities, more closely with various partners at a national level to bring crews back. So a few things worth mentioning there would be certainly the Association of Canadian Port Authorities representing cruise ship interests for our ports across Canada, and also the TIAC National Cruise Committee representing the tourism operators across Canada. And then by way of training, we leaned into a lot of industry expertise to get our ports, as well as work with our communities and cruise industry stakeholders locally to make sure that they, felt like they were ready to welcome back cruise ships. So a lot of collaboration has taken place and will continue to take place as we go forward. So again, I would like to thank you for your time this morning and participating, those participating in the panel discussion, as well as those who are joining us. And I will hand it back to you, Daryl. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Ross Jefferson. Ross is the president and CEO of Discover Halifax, the regional destination marketing organization responsible for overseeing the growth of the tourism economy in Halifax. Ross has an executive MBA from the Richard Ivey School of Business and holds a designation from the Institute of Corporate Directors to achieve the highest standard of directorship. He has also served on several boards, including as past director with the Canadian Automobile Association and the Destination Marketing Association of Canada. Over to you, Ross.
Thank you very much, Daryl, and it is a delight to be a panelist joining my colleagues here today. I'm just going to set my screen up for a share and we'll kick off. Great. Well, again, thank you, everybody, for joining the panel this morning. I thought I would kick off the discussion today, just taking a look at how recovery actually is happening. Now, I am going to be talking using metrics of rooms sold in Halifax. I think this is actually a really good proxy for the overall health of the industry here in HRM, and I think it can be extrapolated throughout much of Atlantic Canada. I think it also speaks to the demand side of return, as well as the implications, which I'll speak to on supply. Before I do, also, I do want to recognize and thank the MacEachen Institute for their support during this time. We also undertook scenario planning specifically for the region and the broader tourism industry beyond cruise, and that exercise had very similar outcomes and results that were shared by Kevin that were specific for cruise. So let's get into, sort of how does recovery, what does it look like? Where are we right now? And I'll share a couple of lessons learned along that time frame. So what you see here in front on your screens is total rooms sold here in Halifax, again, using as a proxy for the health of the tourism industry. This is a typical year pre-COVID. In this graph, you could almost trace perfectly year after year after year for the last decade. We've had a couple of % growth every year, but the pattern almost looks identical. Not to anyone's surprise, we did see an immediate and rapid drop of the tourism industry when the pandemic was declared. And in 2020, people in Atlantic Canada would have been familiar with the Atlantic bubble, the ability to travel only within Atlantic Canada, and we were really constrained from having any visitors join from anywhere else in Canada, or of course anywhere else in the world. So we did see some reprieve during that period. When we started into 2021, we, at this point, had started doing some of our scenario planning exercises. And at this point in time, it was believed by a lot of people we were on a repeat path for the Atlantic bubble into 2021. Our chief medical officer was strongly indicating that it was unlikely that we would be opening up to the rest of Canada until sometime in the fall. Although we were hearing some hints, we knew that the vaccines had started to roll out. There was travel happening between provinces to the rest of Canada. The scenario planning really helped us, just as Kevin had spoken about, to take a look at some variables that were outside of our control and to contemplate the possibilities beyond our control of what might happen and to plan for those. And very much like the cruise exercise, we looked at market confidence in travel either being high or low, and the capacity for the destination to host visitors. Now, in that capacity, that also included whether borders would be open, but it included things like, would we have supply of hotel rooms? Would we have the restaurants opened up? Would we have performances and venues and experiences? And could we actually host visitors in our community? From this exercise, we ended up with the 4 scenarios, as you see on your page. The philosophy that we decided collectively to adopt was we would rather be ready and open and not able to have visitors than to actually rapidly open and not be ready. We did know that there was growing, and we believed, high confidence in travel, and certainly a lot of pent-up demand. Now, of course, that different for different markets, but we believe that visitors did want to travel back. So this was really a question about timing. So at this point, we decided to prepare marketing campaigns, conversations about getting the destination ready. As we know now, we actually did have quite some success after travel restrictions were removed in the beginning of July, the ending of June. We did see a rapid recovery. We're really, quite happy that the destination was, for the most part, prepared. Of course, there were a lot of bumps along the road. But I think we did have a slight advantage being ready for that possible scenario. As we moved into 2022, what we saw in January, you can see by this graph, when Omicron was coming along, there was a lot of pessimism, a lot of concern that we were back on another repeat year from 2021. But again, the scenario planning really encouraged us to think about those different scenarios. And one of the things that we knew was very different is that the milestone that all public health institutions had set of having 2 vaccinations for all Canadians was to be achieved, and it was actually coming up pretty quickly. So in that case, we were preparing for a rapid and fast recovery. And so that is actually what transpired in 2022. We are now actually above pre-COVID levels. We have the highest visitation numbers now on our records for Halifax. And I do attribute the growth and the difference between some of the other destinations, I think, in the industry's strong desire to be ready early. Many of the destinations are caught up now and we have the same growth, but what we really took advantage of was being ready early. Now, likewise, I think there are some other factors that have played into this, but St. John's, Newfoundland, another destination that we saw tremendous growth. In reality, we couldn't see that in Halifax. We just didn't have the supplies of room to be able to have a 18% growth. But the exercise was a very fruitful and very beneficial exercise for our industry. I'll close here just on sort of 3, I think, lessons learned that we really appreciated during this. The first is the recognition of the deep dependency across all partners in the supply chain. This exercise of being ready early was only going to be as strong as the weakest link in the supply chain. If you didn't have labor back in hotels, or if the restaurants weren't ready, car rental agencies, airlines, if those things weren't all aligned, and they weren't all aligned, let's face it, but there was strong alignment for preparations to get back. But the dependency was something that we've never had to really deeply understand until the pandemic happened. The second was a recognition of the two-way dependency between the travel industry and the community. So what do I mean by two-way dependency? I think when the industry virtually closed up, there was a much deeper understanding of the value of the tourism industry. And I don't mean just economic value. Not being able to travel was impacting families. It was impacting businesses. It was impacting things beyond just economics in our regions and affecting community members. But on the economic side, likewise, even municipalities who typically don't think of the revenue from tourism, usually it's sales tax benefits that go to provincial and federal governments. But the property tax decline here in HRM was estimated about $40 million. Or sorry, the value of the total taxes is about $40 million, and deep losses by the municipality when those assessments were being readjusted. The final, and I guess the other piece of that two-way piece is also the recognition that social license and not opening up too early or supporting the community's desire was incredibly important. And I think the cruise industry was a great example of being almost the pointy end of the stick in that. And I think it was well managed on behalf of the partners in recognizing community concerns as well as the importance of the return. The final lesson learned, I think, is just really the recognition of the value of formal destination management. And many of our institutions, we've all been working on demand generation, and all of the keys to the success and during the pandemic were really around the management of the supply chain and the supply side as well as the community side. So I think that is a legacy that many destination marketing organizations like ourselves are now incorporating into the service models that we offer. Before I turn it back to Daryl, I do think that there is one more aspirational point that, I really do hope that we can parlay, and that is we've taught ourselves, I think, that we as an industry and as a country can tackle big issues when we're forced to do so. And this was an incredible crisis beyond the tourism industry. It was an incredible crisis that many of us have come together on. And I do remember there was some hope and discussion during those times that this could be parlayed into the environmental crisis that we have before us globally, specifically within the tourism industry, but also more broadly. So I like to end all of my comments and opportunities to speak to make sure that this challenge is not going unmet, and it is something that I really am, we as an institution, we as an organization will be focusing on, and hope our partners will be with us as well. I'm going to turn it back to Daryl, and thank you again for the time.
Well, thank you, Ross. Our next speaker is Professor Rachel Dodds. Rachel is a professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Toronto Metropolitan University. Rachel is known globally for her work to make tourism more sustainable. Rachel's research focuses on sustainable tourism, over-tourism, destination planning and management, and consumer motivations. Rachel is also the director of Sustaining Tourism, a boutique consultancy, and the founder of Clever Places, an integrated destination dashboard solution. She is the co-author of a new book about sustainable travel called Are We There Yet? Traveling More Responsibly with Your Children, which is available on Amazon. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was not part of the scenario building, and I think I was brought actually to just ask some difficult questions. I think this panel actually was canceled due to a awful weather event, which is indicative of the climate crisis we're now facing. So I was interested to see that actually didn't come up in the scenario planning or anything, which perhaps leads us to the difficult questions to ask. And I suppose I'd like to just start by saying, can we make cruise more sustainable for a destination? And I listened to the presenters. I saw that there was environmental sustainability, but not all aspects of sustainability considered in scenario planning. And also there was a lot of terms about sustainable growth, but just for listeners, sustainable growth is very different than sustainable development. And that's something we need to be cognizant of using words without actually truly thinking about the development aspects for everybody. So just a couple of things I wanted to point out. Some issues is for crews, it's not just about how many ships are coming and what's happening and how many jobs, but it's the percentage of businesses that are locally owned and versus cruise ship owned. So for example, on the west coast of Canada, Granville Island, which was a big cruise destination, realized during the pandemic that they had pretty much no business. But instead of thinking that as a negative, they realized that actually they shifted and realized that actually it should be a local destination first rather than a tourism destination first. And now that's actually shifted to be that way. And locals now are going more than tourists. And so therefore the resiliency is done from a local perspective rather than just relying on cruise ships. The other thing to consider is the time in port. So for example, in Victoria, the majority of cruise ship calls are under 5 hours. And actually cruise ships gain an awful lot of money just by stopping in Canada on the way to Alaska. In the Atlantic provinces, it might be on the way to Greenland, depending on where the ship is going. But just by a brief stop in Canadian waters saves a cruise ship approximately $798 per passenger. So there is the benefit to cruise to stopping in Canadian and ports. And I feel that Canadian ports maybe need to understand that that is an opportunity for negotiation. There's also another issue in terms of the spend versus the impact per visitor. Non-tourism jobs, again, on the West Coast, and some figures were the same on the East Coast, non-tourism jobs created 31 times more jobs than tourism jobs. But a lot of the economic indicators are on how many jobs are created rather than the percentage compared to other industries. So for example, in Vancouver, that was 37,000 non-cruise jobs compared to 1,200 cruise jobs, which is quite a astounding figure. In fact, international students contribute 7 times more than cruise passengers, which is 21% compared to 3%. So that's something to consider. And then there's also the consideration in terms of who's actually paying. So the port tax, which is fantastic for a destination, does that account for the emptying of bilge or the environmental impacts or the port maintenance? Who pays for all these? And it should be noted that it's usually the destination that pays for all those kinds of costs rather than the cruise ship themselves. And then one final issue to consider, especially for Atlantic Canada, is people getting off the boat. So what types of crews are coming? More and more destinations are building bigger ports to have bigger ships, but bigger ships tend to attract those who are gambling, who are have all the amenities on board their ship. Even to this day and age, I think you can go ziplining on a cruise ship. No need to even get off the boat these days. And there is some maintenance by a number of different organizations that outline that about 20 to 40% of passengers never actually get off the boat. So even though the tax is estimated perhaps for $100 per passenger times 3,000 people per the ship, that's actually not necessarily true since so many people don't get off the boat. And this is just a recent article that came out a couple of days ago, and it was a port in Maine that actually has voted to stop the number of cruise ships coming in because they're absolutely so overrun, which leads us, one of the ideas from this article compared tourists to ants swarming. And in places like Barcelona, this is easy to see. I don't think the same issues are happening in the Atlantic provinces yet, but it is something to consider, that there was a lot of talk in the past presentations about the need for stakeholders to work together and whether destinations were actually ready. But the conversation wasn't about whether destinations are actually willing. And so that reframe of perhaps needs to be considered. And then finally, there's environmental issues. On the West Coast again, the killer whales, which are a huge draw for tourists, are actually a huge threat from the amount of boats going through the water. It's not just cruise ships, of course, it's all sorts of different boats, but it is something to consider. And these kinds of things are coming out more and more, that cruise ships are being graded Ds and Fs when it comes to a number of different issues. So now that I've pointed out all the horrifying things, which nobody ever wants to hear, and so I think it's possibly why I'm always invited to stir the pot, I think there is a need to focus on solutions. We spend a lot of time focusing on the problems, but perhaps it's just that the metrics of success need to change. And so a good place to live is also a good place to visit. And I feel like that's something that the pandemic really taught those of us who were stuck at home for 2 years, is we needed to love where we lived. And when you love where you live, but you stop loving it because you're overrun, I believe Halifax had 52 ships stop in September alone. In Victoria, there were only 7 days this summer without a cruise ship. It was very, very fast for community members to start saying, actually, we preferred it without ships. And so there is the financial impact of not having them, but who's benefiting and at what costs? And so I'd like to end the presentation saying, perhaps we just need to change the metrics of success. Perhaps increase the length of time in port rather than 2 or 3 hours. Perhaps reduce the number of ships or the size of ships, because the larger ships tend to have more amenities on board and the amount of people who get off is less and less. Perhaps there needs to be an incentive of fees for the off season, so that when summer is already a busy time for destinations, they're not competing with cruise ships, but instead the incentive is that the port fees are 5 times higher in the summer months when there's already lots of tourists. Perhaps there's an opportunity to create the metrics of success based on resident sentiment surveys. And there were a few presentations that talked about community engagement as important, but rather I would say perhaps community engagement is imperative rather than just important. And so can cruise become beneficial? Yes. Can cruise become sustainable? Never. No tourism can become sustainable, but we can make more sustainable choices and focus on the social as well as the environmental, as well as the financial and political sustainability of a destination. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all of the panelists. We are now going to start the Q&A portion of the event. So to begin with, a couple of requests. Please type your question into the Q&A box. Please direct your questions to one of the speakers. That said, panelists, please feel free to answer any question you wish. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible, but we may not get all of them in. As the audience are typing their questions, I have a few to start us off. My first question is for Ross Jefferson. Ross, how much of an impact is inflation having on regional tourism?
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. We are obviously seeing that prices are going up across the board, whether that's costs for the supply chain, as well as those being passed on to the consumers. We directly are able to measure the average daily rate of rooms. That's being driven up, and usually those are being driven by the supply-demand balance. It's not usually a cost-driven model, and because we have seen quite a significant spike in visitation in the region, we are seeing prices going back up. Here in the Halifax region and across Atlantic Canada, we know as prices go up and as the RevPAR, as it's called in the industry, also goes up, it's the profitability of hotels. We see new hotels then being built. Here in Halifax, we have 4 new hotels being built and expected to open this year, an extra supply of about 13%, and we will and expect to see that will also have an impact, the additional supply on price. Overall, it's interesting that Destination Canada is now saying that we're going to see a rapid recovery of the travel spending, but after it's discounted for inflation, it'll actually be, according to their estimations, 2027 before the industry is fully recovered. From a pricing perspective, they're expecting it to be recovered by 2024. So I think that kind of states how much we're expecting to see inflation being a factor in the travel industry.
Thank you, Ross. I have a question for Rachel. With climate change impacts such as hurricanes, floods, wildfires being felt all over the world, what best practices are you seeing from other jurisdictions in adapting their tourism activities to a new climate reality?
Thank you. It's it's interesting possibly that some destinations are actually starting to think about it. For example, in Oregon, they've just hired a climate scientist as part of their destination marketing organization to look at scenario planning from a climate perspective. And a number of places in Europe are looking at the impacts of sea level rise, increased storms, et cetera, in terms of actually being even able to offer the tourism product. So in Canada, we have the chair of tourism and climate change is actually in Canada, and his name is Dan Scott. He does a number of different planning and scenario buildings, but by far it is not commonplace. And the majority of metrics are still based on growth, average daily rate, numbers of passengers, rather than the resiliency of a destination to climate change. And it's sad, especially with what happened. A number of the attractions across the Atlantic Canadas are no longer. I'm hoping everyone got a chance to see the teacups before they were gone.
Thank you, Rachel. This question is for Sarah. Sarah, any solutions emerging on attracting skilled workers to make up for labor shortages?
Thanks, Daryl. Yes, and I would say this was, really attributed to the time that we spent together during our scenario planning. It allowed us to bring different partners and different industries around the table to actually talk about labor in more depth than usual. So what was presented to us, was, creating new opportunities to work with post-secondary institutions, as well as look at, as mentioned in Kevin's presentation, some settlement agencies. So I'll use the Immigration Services of Nova Scotia as an example. They actually participated in our scenario planning discussions, and that gave us an opportunity to really work together and have conversations and, look at new ways of where to find labor and how to look at maybe cluster employment solutions and, balancing seasons out. Tourism is very seasonal here in Atlantic Canada. But, when it's our season here, it may not be somewhere else. So, sharing labor is also something to take into consideration. And I'd also say we were very fortunate to have so many people come back to work in this industry after not having any cruise ships for 2 years. So many were very eager to get back and to welcome guests and to be part of the experience. So very happy to report that as well. Thank you.
So this question is for Kevin Quigley. Would you say we are in a period of greater uncertainty? And if so, how can scenario planning be used for support?
Well, thanks, Daryl. I was actually thinking about this when with Rachel's comment about disasters and crises and the extent to which we engaged with this question during the scenario planning, which we didn't really. I think that we, but we were actually discussing this yesterday. We had a roundtable at the MacEachen Institute with my graduate class, and we were talking about whether or not scenario planning should be integrated into strategic planning. This could actually be some subset of strategic planning. So one of the challenges around scenario planning is it's extremely time consuming, as I'm sure Sarah knows, and so does Ross. We did so many sessions over an extended period of time. We had the advantage that a number of people, were able to engage. I mean, the pandemic, as much as they were busy and there was lots of stress, they actually had the time to engage. And so I think that was great. And it gave them ways to think and meet. And in fact, a lot of them, I think, welcomed the opportunity to engage on these questions. It's actually very difficult to get people to commit to scenario planning over an extended period of time and give the time that is required. And one of the things I think about is how can we actually shorten the process and make it shorter and sharper, particularly when you get to, senior people in organizations, how they got the time to engage with scenario planning. And that's an ongoing challenge. I think to do it well, you need a committed group over an extended period of time. I think we absolutely had that during the pandemic in our work with Discover Halifax and our work with the ACCA, no question about it. But those were unusual times. And so you sort of think, how can we use this tool? So if we were going to think about things like Fiona, for example, which is very much sort of up my alley, like sort of disaster crisis stuff. Can you use the scenario planning tool to explore, different plausible futures around natural disasters, crises, industrial failures, or whatever? I think you can, but there are operational challenges. When I solicited feedback from people who participated, one of the comments was, we need to make sure the right people are around the table. And this is certainly a crucial step in scenario planning, making sure the right people are there. It's very hard because people they're limited in their availability and their time. So that's one of the challenges. So I welcome this comment about thinking of it as a subset to strategic planning and actually embedding it in your strategic planning process. So I think that's actually not a bad way for organizations to think about it. So if you're going to have a strategic retreat every year, and I suspect a lot of organizations build that into their calendar, there may be a half day or something where you would have scenario planning exercises. And of course, the more people become familiar with it and the tools, it won't be such a big learning curve every time they engage. So I would suggest that would be one way to use the tools on an ongoing basis, knowing that in the future, I don't think people are going to have the same kind of time that they had in the past to engage in these processes. And in terms of, are we dealing with a period of greater uncertainty? Never really sure how to answer that question. I feel like uncertainty is pervasive. There's certain risks we look at, and when we do, we always ignore other risks and other trade-offs. So it's important not to be too narrow in the way we think about risk. I mean, there are trade-offs. The pandemic teaches us this, but in risk management, we think about it all the time. There are trade-offs in every risk decision that you make. There is no zero risk option in life. And so we have to be aware of that. There are trade-offs. It's a question of striking the balance, I suppose. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So I have a question here. I've modified it. I really broke it up into two questions, and it's for Ross. Do the Atlantic provinces have enough academic programs to form the workforce needed for sustainable tourism? And how is the region preparing their people to receive the benefits of tourism growth?
Thanks, Daryl. Look, I think there are some wonderful academic institutions that have programs specifically for tourism. And I think if we really peel it back and look at those people that are employed directly or indirectly, it doesn't necessarily come from programs that train people specifically in tourism. So, we still need plumbers to operate mechanical systems. We need accountants and people in finance to run operations. Yes, there are specific skills that can be trained and are specific to the tourism industry. And I do think that there are wonderful institutions that are that today in Atlantic Canada are preparing us for this. I think the broader opportunity really is it's probably in how companies generally treat their employees or reward their employees. I think the new era right now is that the assets are our people, and there was a time when the supply demand balance was at a point where you could have a transition of people in your businesses, and today that's just not the reality. That if you're going to be a successful business, whether it's in the tourism industry or not, you have to look after your people, and I think that will be a fundamental shift, not only for the tourism industry but for all industries, about care for our people and making sure that we're meeting the needs of our labor force. So and forgive me, Daryl, your second question was
Ross, I think we're going to have to actually call it there.
Okay.
We're winding down for time, and I realize we didn't also get to some of the other questions. But it is time to wrap up the discussion, and I want to thank you very much for all the to all the speakers for their thought-provoking remarks and stimulating discussion. I'd like to thank the MacEachen Institute for hosting this event. You can download a copy of the scenario planning report and briefing note on the MacEachen Institute website, dal.ca/MIPP. A recording of this panel will be available on the MacEachen Institute YouTube page in a day or two. See you next time. Thank you.